Well, you're coming up on your last day as mayor.
That's right.
January 1st. And what are you most proud of and what do you most regret?
Well, the thing I'm most proud of is that the city believes in itself again. It sounds intangible, but I think it's the most important thing that's changed in my time as mayor. We were characterized in the national press as a dying city at the beginning of the decade, and that's largely because of what our community had been up against for years, for decades, really, ever since a lot of the factories closed in the 1960s. And I came in working to set up a number of things that were quantifiable, data-driven policy changes on everything from improving the way we serve residents to making sure economic opportunity is more widely felt, to dealing with a crisis of vacant houses that were especially impacting homeowners in low-income and minority neighborhoods in the city. And we've got a lot of measurable things that have come out of that, from the impact we had on vacant houses to reductions in the poverty rate, dramatic reduction in the unemployment rate, considerably faster than what happened as a whole in the country during the recovery. But for all of those things that you can count, the thing I'm proudest of is something you can't quite measure, but you can absolutely feel on the ground in the city. And it's that there's just a different sense of the trajectory of our community. Of course, there's also a lot of unfinished business, and I suppose every mayor thinks of the things that you wish you could stick around until you'd fully seen them through. And the biggest is that we continue to be impacted by gun violence a great deal in our city. We have taken a lot of proactive, ambitious steps, and it's certainly changed lives. Seeing a young person stand up taller after they participate in some of the job training programs, for example, that we routed people into who are coming out of some of the most deadly and violent gangs and groups in the city. But you can't feel satisfied when we're still seeing the numbers of people impacted by gun violence that we are. We got a lot of work to do tearing down walls of mistrust between communities of color and the police department. Again, a lot of progress we can point to. Certainly, we are light years ahead of where we were with a department that didn't have really a measurable process for how promotions worked, or the kinds of implicit bias or civil rights training that we've been able to introduce, or the kind of community empowerment through the transparency and involvement of community members in setting policy. But no one can say that our work is done in that regard. Tons of work that the next administration will have to take up and carry forward.
I wanted to ask you more about gun violence. Overall, property crimes, for example, are down in the city during your tenure, but gun violence, number of shootings have just kind of remained stubbornly steady. Mm-hmm. How does that inform how you approach gun violence on the national level?
Well, one thing it shows is the importance of gun policy. You know, we adopted some of the best practices in the country for how you deal, in particular, with gang and group-related gun violence. And I remember a couple of years ago being at a convening with a fellow mayor from a different state who was really celebrating dramatic reductions that they had been able to drive in gun violence. And I was thinking, what does she know that I don't? And we had a conversation about all the steps we took. And I found that our two cities were adopting very similar strategies, even engaging some of the same national experts. But one difference was that her state was one that had also enacted meaningful policies on access to guns themselves. My state of Indiana, as you might expect, has done very little, and in fact ties the hands of its mayors when it comes to acting. And so it was a reminder that no matter how much good law enforcement work, community work, faith-based work, and community-oriented violence reduction efforts you take up, if we continue to be in an environment where you have the loopholes that we've got, where we lack universal background checks, it's going to be a struggle. Not that can prevent every incident of gun violence, but we know that this country needs things like red flag laws, needs common sense measures that most people support, including most Republicans, most gun owners, but for reasons I think we all understand pretty well, not most members of the Senate. And we've got to change that.
Talking about cities, what do you think are the most important things that the federal government could do to help cities, and talk about your strategies in that respect?
Well, the way I think of it is the answers don't all have to come from Washington, but more of the resources should. So one of the patterns you'll see in a lot of my policies is that they call for locally driven problem solving to be supported with federal dollars. On health equity and dealing with racial inequity and health outcomes, we're proposing health equity zones that are often developed locally but get federal assistance. On disaster preparedness, we're proposing regional resiliency hubs. On mental health, healing and belonging grants. So it's a thread through all of the different things that we're looking at in very different policy areas, that a lot of the best problem solving is happening at the local level. Even on manifestly global issues like climate, one of the things we're seeing is the network of C40 cities from around the world who basically got tired of waiting for their national governments to catch up and began implementing their own climate action plans, consistent often with the goals in the Paris Climate Accord. There should be a wind at the back of those local problem solvers from federal government, not by trying to lay out all of the answers, but by establishing a certain floor and then funding a lot of those local solutions.
What about housing, for example?
Another great example where we need to do more. Now, there are some tools that are already in the toolkit, and I believe just need more resources. CDBG would be a good example. Community development block grants that were a very big part of how we've been able to tackle some of the housing equity challenges in our own city. The simple fact that public housing in this country is very much in need of more support. Our plan calls for 7 million people to be benefited. 2 million of that is through new affordable housing being built, but a lot of that is supporting families with federal tools that exist that can be set up in partnership with local communities. Look, housing issues are very different from one community to another. People look at me funny when I'm in a place like Oakland or New York talking about what a house costs in South Bend, but in South Bend or in Iowa, there are housing affordability challenges there too. They're just different. So we know that one size fits all isn't going to work. But we also know that some of these problems don't get fixed without the intervention of federal resources.
One of the things you've talked about a lot is housing choice vouchers, especially for low-income families. How does that, though, not just kind of drive up rents further and also just kind of be a windfall for landlords?
Well, this is another example of why we've got to work with local communities. So measures to ensure that this doesn't just lead to upward pressure on prices. Rent control policies, for example, those need to be supported at the local level. And we need to make sure there's federal pressure to ensure that states don't constrict and constrain local communities that are seeking to do that work. But there's a lot of evidence that even if there is an overall rise in prices, it will not be as much as the benefit made by the availability of those subsidies. Now, you also have to have accountability for landlords. We've got to make sure that there's a standard being met in terms of quality. And one of the things we've had to work on locally is the ability to inspect and provide some assurance that whether there's federal dollars involved or not, people are living in safe housing conditions. I'm in one of many communities with a tremendous challenge from lead poisoning. Not because of the water. I'm in charge of the water, and I guarantee it's great. It's because of the houses. It's because of the homes that disproportionately low-income people are living in. Anytime you enact a subsidy program, you've got to look at the ripple effects through the economy. But we know that the bottom line is it will make vulnerable families better off.
One of the effects of the 1,000 Homes in 1,000 Days program, which led to demolishing a lot of homes and then fixing up others, is kind of gaps in the community where there's sort of like this broken teeth sort of syndrome of housing. So, I mean, we see in Iowa that there is just not investment in some of the inner city neighborhoods or in our small towns. So where there just is not private investment going into housing, how do you help those areas?
Yeah, so a vacant lot is much better than a collapsing house, but it's not a solution. Now, part of what we got to recognize is that we got a lot of cities in our part of the country whose population and footprint will be diminished for years or decades, even as we rehabilitate housing markets. And so part of it is creatively holding the land. And we've seen lots of really creative ideas applied that empower neighbors. A very simple one is there are a lot of neighbors who will take on a side lot to a property that they might not even own, but we encourage them to control it. and to look after it and make sure there's not some kind of penalty if they do decide to take it on. That's part of what we have in mind through the ability of resources to help people building equity in neighborhoods often that people have been redlined into, but to make sure that you don't take on a total cost of ownership that makes you worse off. Sometimes the community has to take responsibility, although we should be careful with the idea of turning every vacant space into a pocket park. Sometimes that means even more cost to a community. But the bottom line is we need to be investing in areas that have been underinvested. And that's largely about the fundamentals, not so much the toolkit that's in your economic development policy set, but just making sure that there is safety, that there is access to health care, that there are jobs. And while we talk a lot about job growth strategies, I don't think we talk nearly enough about population growth strategies. If we have more of a view toward literally just ensuring that we're encouraging more people to live and grow in a community, then of course that has a knock-on effect for being able to fill in some of those missing teeth in neighborhoods that might have been emptied out by an economic shock 10 or even 50 years ago. One of the things I've been very pleased to see, since it was a political risk, was the positive response in more rural and often conservative areas to ideas like the community renewal visa that we propose. This is part of our immigration plan. And the idea is that if a community is pursuing a population growth strategy, they can apply for an allotment of community renewal visas for immigrants who commit to being in those areas for a given amount of time, who are then fast-tracked to a green card. And what we found is that a lot of rural or industrial and sometimes depopulating areas are much more aware than they get credit for of the value of immigration as part of how you build out your population. So it takes a lot to get this flywheel going. Sometimes the direct question of a physical lot or a house, working on that is kind of the end of the chain after you've taken care of some of the basics and the fundamentals to lift up a neighborhood or a community that's been struggling.
About a week ago in Iowa, Bernie Sanders called your Medicare for All Who Want It a failed idea because he says, that the sick and the poor will go to the public option and the rich and the healthy will stay with their private insurance. Why is he wrong about that?
Well, anytime you set up a risk pool, you got to do risk management, but it's not as though this is the first time anybody's tried to set that up. And there are lots of risk management strategies to make sure you come out of the gate with enough people bought into the plan that it's going to stand on its own. And remember, if folks like him, and for that matter, folks like me, are right, that one of the biggest sources of inefficiency and underperformance in the existing healthcare system is the profit motive, then a plan that doesn't have that will be dramatically more effective and deliver better care at a lower cost. In other words, the more he's right, the more my plan will work. And it might be one of the reasons why, as recently as 10 years ago, he was editorializing in favor of a similar vision. Look, if you believe that a public health insurance strategy is the right one, then I believe it would make sense to have a way to get there organically without hoping that Washington can correctly guess the manner and the timing of everybody coming over. I just think there ought to be a little bit of humility as a believer in public health care, or as a believer in public health insurance, I should say. I just think there ought to be a little humility in the strategy. And if we're right that this public health insurance is going to be better, everybody's going to want it. And if we're wrong, or at least if we're wrong for certain families or people in certain situations, we're going to be really glad, and they're going to be really glad that we didn't kick them off of it. This allows us to have that flexibility in the vision while getting to the same goal, and has the added benefit, just in terms of governing a country that is frighteningly divided today, of holding together a majority that is ready to embrace what would amount to the biggest reform that healthcare in America has seen in a half century, rather than further polarizing us by telling some people what's good for them.
Part of your plan talks about a lot about mental health as well.
Yes.
And it starts with the basic premise that we need to end the stigma.
Yes.
So What can you point to that you personally or as mayor have done to help destigmatize mental health care?
Well, in the context of South Bend, we in particular focused on this in dealing with addiction and making sure that we sent a message that those who had been battling addiction were actually one of our greatest resources. And we supported a program to invite folks who had overcome or were overcoming addiction to be navigators for people who were hospitalized in that very dangerous zone between when you recover from an overdose and when somebody is able to see you, which we know is a sometimes weeks-long process, and your life depends on whether you get through it. A lot of it's just in the way we talk about it, even the campaign. Part of the good I think we can do in this campaign before the first vote is even cast is to let everybody know that this is an issue that deserves to be talked about. So often, I think we did it again yesterday in Indianola when the topic comes up, I just asked for a show of hands of folks who would say that they or somebody they love or somebody they work with had a serious mental illness or an addiction challenge. And just about every hand goes up. And a lot of it is just breaking this idea that it's something kind of off in the corner. Now, a lot of this has policy implications, of course, and it's everything from the Healing and Belonging grants to the need to make sure that we're encouraging more people to go into the field of mental health because we have a provider shortage. It's things like mental health first aid for first responders and teachers, but what good does that do if you've been coached in your first aid course on how to identify a problem, but you got nowhere to refer somebody to when you do? So a lot of it is nuts and bolts policy work, but a lot of it's cultural. And I've saw it as mayor and as a candidate, and will be certain as president, to speak to these issues in a way that makes it as natural to talk about a struggle with bipolar disorder as it would be to talk about how you got a knee surgery coming up.
You've had more connection than most, probably, as far as being able to see up close the VA medical system and how well it treats soldiers and returning soldiers, perhaps particularly. This editorial board has said that maybe you should do away with the VA system so that any soldier can go anywhere to get health care right away. What do you think of that idea? So
the number two thing I hear from veterans talking about the VA is a level of frustration with backlogs, with the process, with the bureaucracy. It's second only to the number one thing I hear, which is a fierce insistence that care not be taken away. Consider the example of mental health, where we've seen a shortage of mental health providers inside the VA. We've even seen this horrifying set of stories of veterans who get so desperate they take their own lives in the parking lot of a VA. The other side of that story, though, is that the single biggest predictor of whether we're going to lose a veteran to suicide, whether they're going to be one of those 20 people that we lose every day, is if they never got connected up to VA care in the first place. If they actually got in to VA care and got connected up, even though there are still problems inside that system, it's the single biggest thing that reduces their odds of being lost. There's a reason why we have a dedicated department for this. And part of that reason is that different wars have different wounds. We as a society would not know what we know about Agent Orange if there weren't a dedicated Veterans Administration treating Vietnam veterans and coming to terms with what that led to. Right now, I don't believe we would know as a society what we do about post-traumatic stress, about traumatic brain injury, if it weren't for the dedicated care in the military medical system, yes, but also in the VA. So I believe passionately that we need to make improvements, in particular truing up clinical pay so that we can address those shortages and taking the red tape out of the process of people applying to work in the VA. But that doesn't mean that we somehow benefit veterans by chucking out the system entirely.
But how do you reconcile, one of our arguments is, how do you reconcile the shortage of providers? I mean, like you said, every time the VA hires someone, and we've seen this in Des Moines, you take a provider from everyone who's not part of the VA, it doesn't go to the VA. So one of the things Bernie says is he wants 50,000 more workers at the VA. That's 50,000 workers that won't be serving 300 million Americans.
I just can't accept that zero-sum mentality. What we got to look, anytime there's a shortage of anything, my first question is, have you tried paying more? And I think that's certainly true for providers in the VA, for providers in underserved areas like mental health as a whole, for rural providers. And this has implications for everything from reimbursement rates with CMS all the way through to clinical compensation rates inside the VA. But getting this right is about making sure we address a wholesale provider shortage, not robbing Peter to pay Paul.
So what's your plan for that?
Well, it's one of the reasons why I've proposed that we increase clinical pay. It's one of the reasons why I've proposed that we ensure both within the reimbursement system that there's more of a recognition for the importance of people serving underserved areas, but also outside of reimbursement, making sure that when we contemplate things like public service loan forgiveness, a great idea, almost impossible to actually take advantage of, that when we reform that program, we not only reform access to public service loan forgiveness, but also consider what it means to be in public service. And I would argue, even if you don't have a .gov or .org email address, if you're a medical or mental health provider to an underserved population, that is public service. So we can take concrete steps. Yes, it costs money. There's an investment there, but I think it's an investment that we would do well to make, both inside and outside of our healthcare system.
So what's the mechanism you use to increase clinical pay?
Well, we just plain have to be ready to fund it. Often...
Aren't those, I mean, they're not government workers, right?
Well, with VA, a lot of folks were, there are some complex contract structures, but
as well, right?
Yes, right. So part of it's reimbursement. And I'm especially thinking about what it's going to take to keep these clinical providers in rural areas alive.
Right.
That's why we got to do more with the rural emergency medical center designation. Make sure that is used to capture the value of some of these providers, but also on a wholesale basis reevaluate the reimbursement rates to show that we have some regard for the added value of a provider who might be the only reason somebody doesn't have to drive an hour or two for anything from having a child, and we've seen the consequences of losing birthing centers in places like Marshalltown here in Iowa, to getting the mental health care that they need. Now, it's not only that. There are other measures we've got to take. We've got to supplement some of this care with telemedicine, not in a way that ever compromises in-person care, but in a way that spares people, and just as importantly, their families, from long commutes to be able to get care, if they can get it at all, because we know what the wait lists are like.
Back to the pay issue, the compensation issue. The incentive is just the opposite in Medicare and Medicaid. Those programs try to drive down how much providers get. How you can turn that around? I mean, the costs are already extraordinary.
Right, but there's a distinction between clinical pay for somebody staffing a lonely outpost of medical care in a rural area, and the upward pressure on provider costs being created by things like the consolidation of for-profit hospitals. It's one of the reasons why market consolidation, I think, is as much a concern in the provision of healthcare as it is in areas like farming. And we got to pay attention to that. So yes, the purchasing power and bargaining power of the government can be a powerful downward pressure, and rightly so, on costs of everything from inpatient care to pharmaceuticals, which is why I think most of us believe it's a no-brainer that we allow Medicare to negotiate drug prices. But we're talking specifically about things that impact people's willingness to enter and remain in certain medical fields. I believe that there are ways that we can set not only the reimbursement rates, but the quality metrics that CMS expects in its evaluations to encourage individuals to be in the field, while still ensuring that other sources of runaway cost, many of which have nothing to do with actual direct patient care, are controlled.
Can we get back to something you mentioned in your opening remarks, which was your relationship with communities of color? So I don't know if you know this, but Black Lives Matter of South Bend held a press call last week in advance of the debate, and as you probably know, they were quite critical of your administration and its relations with the Black community. They talked about 2 police shootings of Black people, 1 hanging, which is now the subject of a lawsuit. They said you had fired a black police chief and that you have not appointed enough African Americans to significant posts in your administration. There was a whole litany of criticisms that they had, but I'm just wondering if you can talk a little bit to why there would be those perceptions of you not having served the black community appropriately by this organization, and what maybe have you learned from the whole thing?
Sure. So, first of all, most voters of color in South Bend support me, and I think it's important to begin with that.
Are you talking African Americans? Because they wanted to be very specific about African Americans.
And of course, I also have my critics. I think one of the people on that press call was one of my fiercest critics in South Bend. But he's also somebody who endorsed a Republican candidate for mayor who said that systemic racism doesn't exist. So there's a lot of complicated dynamics, as there are in every community, among different folks who are involved. But you can tell some of this is a narrative being driven. Like one of the incidents that you mentioned took place outside of the city of South Bend and before I was mayor. So that being said, I don't want to dismiss some of the concerns. Some of the concerns are very real. And many of them were waiting for me when I took office. And we were able to improve a lot of these areas. And there are areas where we came up short. The areas where we were able to make a big difference included empowering more community voices, bringing folks to the table on areas like civil rights training, how we set up the use of body cameras, how use of force policies are even set. We've been working to empower community members in having input on that. Work to be one of the regional leaders in just police transparency, getting information out there, all the way to the point of publishing at an incident level, use of force data. And when we did that, we saw use of force complaints go down. Implementing implicit bias training, implementing civil rights training. One of the reasons I appointed an African American police chief in my first act when I took office, was an understanding of the importance of community policing and diversity. I later parted ways with that chief because of the federal criminal investigation into the department from practices taking place while he was chief before I became mayor. But I also understood all of the pain that process unleashed. And we worked through it as a community. And we continue to work through it. This is something that I think we need to recognize will not improve without a great deal of intention. And because it's facing every diverse community in the country, it's going to require national leadership to support mayors and departments trying to do the right thing. When we encountered some of the problems we had in my first year in particular, I could reach out to the Department of Justice and to the White House under President Obama and find people ready to help and support us in working to do the right thing and improve police accountability and police transparency. When this current administration came in, I have heard from them on the subject of policing from the Department of Justice precisely once. And it was when they sent me a letter threatening our grant funding unless I effectively signed on to help them carry out their immigration policy. It was part of that attack on sanctuary cities. And after a lot of consultation with lawyers and other mayors, we decided to cross out all of the parts that we consider unacceptable and send a letter back. But my point is the difference that it makes, whether you have federal leadership committed to working with cities to help do the right thing. Now, the reason why the majority of African American elected officials in South Bend who have supported any candidate in this race are supporting me is not because they or I think things have been perfect. It's because we've been working side by side to empower those who've been excluded, not only in the area of policing and justice, but in areas like economic opportunity creation. We didn't even have the ability when I took office to assess fully how much of the business we were doing as a city was going to be with businesses owned by minorities and women. Created the office that was capable of doing that. I signed an executive order empowering that office to conduct an audit, knowing that the numbers that came back were not going to be very good, but also knowing that we had to document it so that under the state of Indiana's laws, I could sign into law our own hard targets on how to lift up procurement. So this is a story of a journey from where we were to where we are to where we need to be. And I believe the reason that the minority voters who know me best Not everyone, for sure. And I also, by the way, have a lot of folks who will be a big fan of one of my policies and one of the biggest critics of another. And that's natural when you're in charge. But the reason why we do have the level of support that we do is the experience of having worked together side by side with goodwill and getting real results to show for it.
So just,
why then do you think that there has been a persistent criticism, not only from your own town, but across the country, of you particularly on race? And that hasn't been repeated for other candidates who are white. Why has it been targeting you?
Well, I'll leave it to others to discuss the dynamics of media narratives. What I'll say is that, first of all, because I'm the mayor of a city that has complex and difficult experiences, this is not something that I've encountered as an academic discussion or while debating legislation. This is something where we have tried to manage some of the toughest issues around racial and economic justice that can come forward. And have had to answer for all of the ways in which these issues, which I didn't create, but nor did we completely resolve them, of course, have unfolded. Part of it's that we're also working with a lot of voters who have felt taken for granted. Voters who see politicians, especially politicians like me, show up in the churches, show up in the neighborhoods just before an election. Voters, and in particular I'm thinking about African American women, who have often been the backbone of Democratic turnout, especially in the South, have changed the outcome of elections in places like Alabama, where my party for a long time I think would have despaired of being able to get anywhere. And yet these same voters feel often taken for granted. And so the newer you are, the more you've got to demonstrate what it is you have to offer. And I think that helps to explain the gap between the support, again, not unanimous support, but meaningful support that I have at home with the voters who know me best, and the need to build out a greater level of support in the South, where there is such frustration, I think. And so we've made sure to have the right development of our outreach there too, but not just traditional big events or TV appearances, but smaller conversations where there was a two-way discussion going on, listening as well as speaking, on everything from health equity that we were sitting in Charleston to discussing, to entrepreneurship and economic opportunity in rural South Carolina. We went to Allendale County, South Carolina, lowest income county in the state. Now you'd think in a state like South Carolina, which like Iowa is an early primary state, or early nominating state, that they would have seen a lot of presidential candidates. They told me they hadn't seen a candidate in more than a decade. And it's very important to me in particular to reach out to those who feel they've either been passed over or taken for granted. But I believe as we do, we can earn the support, because again, the voters who know me best, I believe, I don't swim around in poll numbers too much, but I believe it's in Iowa that we have some of our best support with non-white voters. So closer to home, folks know me better, and I recognize that creates a challenge further from home, especially in the South. I welcome that challenge, because it's not just part of how you win, it's part of how you deserve to win.
What about the argument that you become a risky candidate to be the nominee of the Democratic Party, given how crucial the black vote is to winning the presidency?
Again, we're going to earn that vote, and I think any candidate coming forward will have strengths and vulnerabilities. And I can think of certainly quite a few of my competitors, some of whom are doing very well with minority voters, who could also be attacked on their relationship with minority voters in a general election. At the end of the day, we have to put forward the person we believe will make the right president for our time, and then rally as a party behind that candidate. And while my party is famously fractious and varied, I also believe that we can come together. We have to come together, especially at this moment, where even compared to 2016, where there was a sense of a wolf at the gates, this time the wolf is through the gates, eating our chickens. We cannot afford to be anything but unified when the time comes.
You're taking a lot of heat from Elizabeth Warren right now about fundraising. Until the day when there's public financing of campaigns, until Citizens United is overturned, how do you say, and to the American public and show that you won't be beholden to big money interests that you're going to for funds in some cases?
Well, first of all, let's not give up on campaign finance reform. It's clearly what has to happen, but it's not going to happen between now and next November. Now, we have, I think, about 700,000 contributors to my campaign. Last I checked, the average contribution was coming in around $30. And I am going to look for help from anybody who wants to see President Trump defeated and anybody who shares the values of this campaign. Anybody who supports this campaign also should know that what they're signing on to are the values and the policies that I've put forward. And like my neighbors at home, some folks who support this campaign may support some of my policies and not be as wild about some of the others. That's okay. But we are building the campaign we're going to need in order to defeat a president who will pull out all of the stops in order to stay in power. Now, I did not get into elected politics in order to make life easier for those who are already powerful and well off. My entry into elected politics was when I walked away from a comfortable job in business to move home to Indiana to stand with auto workers at a time when our own state treasurer was trying to block the rescue of the auto companies. Because I had seen how devastated a community could be, as mine had been, and what happened to families when you lose your employers and industry. I traded the offices I used to work in for the basement of the building trades hall in St. Joe County, Indiana, and spent my life savings, such as they were from 2.5 years in the private sector, traveling the state of Indiana, knowing that I would very likely get clobbered because it was 2010, shaping up to be a big Republican year, and I was an unheard of 28-year-old in one of the most conservative states in the country, but also believing somebody had to stand up for what was right, stand up for workers. And through my time in office, serving my city, I have very often had to make a decision that might have displeased old friends or powerful people or supporters in my campaign. But you have no business running for office if you're not ready to do that. And it's the same for the presidency. This is our country. Running for president at one of the highest stakes moments that the presidency has ever seen. And I will welcome the support of people of varying different backgrounds and varying means to fund this campaign, just as I'm looking to draw in the votes of everybody we can get to vote for this campaign. It's why I'm calling out to progressives, to moderates, to independents. It's why we're reaching out and welcoming a lot of what I'm calling future former Republicans. And we're seeing a lot of them on the trail who, I'm not tricking anybody. They know we're not going to agree on a lot of the policies. But we agree on the big values that are at stake. And we agree that it's time for a change in Washington. I want anybody who wants to be part of this fight to know that they are welcome in the effort we're trying to build.
You've also taken some heat for your work for McKinsey, and you've been able to now disclose a bit more about that than you initially were able to because of the non-disclosure agreements. If you could have a do-over, would you have worked for McKinsey?
I learned a lot from my time in the private sector. I learned how to work with data. I learned a lot about how the business world works, and if you're managing the largest economy in the world, it's probably good to have at least a little bit of professional experience with an income statement and a balance sheet. But I'm also glad that I stepped away. I'm glad that I walked away from that and into public service. There have been some trade-offs with that. That's one of the reasons why I'm by far the least wealthy person running for president right now. But I found pretty quickly that public service was for me.
You've said since then that McKinsey reflects what's wrong with corporate America. How so?
Well, I think what they do is they help businesses maximize their profits. Not always. I mean, some of what I worked on was actually climate change work for nonprofits and for the government. But corporate America as a whole is designed to get as much as it can out of the economy under the rules as they're written. And the problem is, the rules have now been written in a way that it's completely out of whack. I mean, if companies from Amazon to Chevron to Starbucks are making billions in profits and paying less in taxes than Chasten and I did last year, specifically 0, negative tax rates on some of these companies, it's clear that something's out of whack. Now, at the end of the day, while a lot of the accountability does rest with corporate decision makers, the biggest failures, I think, have been in policies that don't contain this corporate behavior. In other words, we've got to make some decisions at the policy level about how we want the balance between work and wealth, how we want the balance between profit-seeking and public benefit to work in this country. And right now, that balance is not where it needs to be. We look at things like the inequality that's risen in our country over the course of really my entire lifetime. It's not the result of some mysterious cosmic force. Sure, there have been a lot of complicated things happening with globalization and technology, but it's mostly the result of policy decisions made on purpose, largely beginning with the Reagan era, that have led us to this point. Tax policy, regulation, and it's got to change. And we should not expect things to improve without the intervention of policymakers making better policies.
So speaking of policies, a couple of your fellow candidates are supporting a moratorium on mergers between giant agricultural concerns. Where do you stand on that?
I do think we need to not only look at intercepting upcoming mergers, but also look back at ones that have taken place that may be doing much more harm than good. Now, this isn't only a problem in ag. We certainly see this problem in tech. We see this, as I said earlier, I'm concerned about for-profit hospital systems merging and gathering such scale that it's really pushing up costs. But it's certainly the case in ag. And it's on both ends. Right? You talk to farmers, they're squeezed between not having a lot of suppliers to buy supplies from and not having a lot of places to sell their goods to. So we need an FTC that's empowered to vigorously look at and police these things. And in the case of, in particular, tech, where it's tougher to measure the impact on pricing for companies whose product is free to most of its users, but still has a very problematic effect when they grow too big, too powerful, we may have to shift the way that these mergers are cleared so that the burden is not on the government to prove that it would do harm, but on the proposed merger to prove that it wouldn't.
So what about a moratorium?
I'm not ready to call for a blanket end to any change. I will call for a higher standard and for us to be vigilant about making sure that these things don't take place in a way that's going to hurt us.
Is antitrust enforcement an answer?
Absolutely. I mean, first of all, we need to increase the resources going into antitrust enforcement. Again, I think it probably goes beyond that. I think the scope of what's available to antitrust enforcers needs to increase and be modernized. But a lot of it's just the level of enforcement that we're willing to undertake. And again, empowering bodies like the FTC to intervene.
You mentioned tax policy, and you've talked about a 1% capital gains tax. Could you talk about that versus the wealth tax that Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren have talked about, their versions?
Sure. I think it'd be more accurate to say for capital gains, we need to true it up to where it's not taxed at a lower level than income. And I think that includes mark-to-market reform so that you're also not deferring capital gains. A big part of what we need to do to fund all of the things I'm proposing is on the capital gains side. A lot of it's just rolling back the Trump tax cuts. There's a 199A loophole. And again, there's an enforcement question. A lot of it's enforcement of what we've already got. The virtue of a wealth tax is that it is conceptually simple, and it's got precedent in terms of how we certainly fund a lot of other things in the public sector. I come at this as a mayor who uses property taxes to fund police, fire, and a lot of the important things we do locally. So we can see the appeal. The other virtue of the wealth tax is it goes to folks who are doing just fine and still will be after it's assessed. The reason it's further down the list, though, of things I would use to fund my signature programs is that it's also very vulnerable to being attacked in the courts. Doesn't mean we can't have it. It means you'd better have a really, really strong plan B if you're relying on it to fund some of the signature policies that you think will change American life in the 21st century. And I believe that things we know are constitutionally rock solid and that we have a precedent for. Again, a lot of what I'm talking about is rolling back tax cuts created by the Trump administration, closing loopholes, improving enforcement. That's the first place I'm going to look to raise the funds that we need. And it's very important to me that all of the things I propose we do on the cost side, from the housing subsidies to childcare to education, making college free for most, to the healthcare policies, be matched with pay-fors. I think I've talked a lot about why I think my party needs to be unafraid of owning fiscal responsibility, especially looking at how the other parties behaved. And so now is the time for us to demonstrate that we're ready to pay for everything that we're saying ought to happen. That the sum total of everything we propose should be deficit reducing, or at least, at worst, deficit neutral.
Why? Nobody seems to be worried about deficits.
Well, maybe it's a generational outlook. I figure I might be here when some of these fiscal time bombs go off. And I don't want to be simplistic about this. Deficit spending can have its place, especially when you're managing a recession, especially when you're making investments that pay for themselves. But some things pay for themselves and some things don't. Decarceration pays for itself. Early childhood investments pay for themselves. Good infrastructure projects pay for themselves. Giant tax cuts on the wealthy do not. And one of the most important findings of the last 40 years is that we tried supply side and measured whether it's true or not that those tax cuts pay for themselves. And the answer is a very clear, unambiguous, resounding no. So we got to be smarter about what investments we make. And we've got to recognize that there is a certain level of debt to GDP ratio that we just don't want to be. It's not so much about the ratio. It's about the dollars that could be going into something else that are going by the hundreds of billions into serving the debt. Right? We would have more to work with for housing. We'd have more to work with for healthcare. We'd have more to work with for Title I if so much were not programmed for debt service. So I'm not dogmatic about this. I'm not a total deficit hawk, but we've definitely got to own this, especially because the Republican Party has made abundantly clear that even though they're happy to use the deficit as an excuse to resist policies that my party proposes, when they come to power, they reveal that they don't care.
So it's more than just servicing the debt, though. It's entitlement programs, Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid. How do you deal with those?
Well, first of all, I am allergic to the use of the word entitlement to describe programs that people pay for. And I also think there's been a fair amount of scaremongering about certainly on the Social Security side, the solvency and resiliency of that program. It's true that we're on track on a business as usual level to have a problem. But you make a couple of simple moves, like extending payroll tax collection to income over $250,000. And other moves that have no impact on benefits. And Social Security Trust Fund is just fine by the time I'm collecting it. Medicare and Medicaid, more challenging, much more challenging. But that takes us back to the conversation we were having earlier about the cost side, right? I get why the insurance debate is consuming almost all of the attention when it comes to healthcare. But we got to look at the cost side. We can save hundreds of billions just through common sense moves like negotiating drug prices with pharmaceuticals. And it's important to acknowledge and listen to doctors who are warning us that just taking Medicare as we know it, copy-pasting it, and giving it to more people, that's not enough. Because there are a lot of reforms that have to happen under the hood. It's unglamorous stuff. Some of it's highly technical. But if the checkout at Target is automated, and yet we still have the number of human hands touching a prior authorization for Medicare that we do right now, something's off. And so we've got to wrangle down the cost side too. I think we can do that without going back on the promise we make to people who pay into this.
Not the revenue side?
How's that?
The revenue side?
Well, part of what I'm talking about when we're contemplating tax reform, is to make sure that we can fund what I'm proposing we do with healthcare. But we estimate the sum total of 10 years of what I believe we need to do on Medicare for all who want it comes to a cost of about $1.5 trillion. Not a small number. But it is dramatically smaller than even the margin of error among the competing estimates over what some of my competitors' plans would cost. So yes, it's raising the revenue, and I can explain where that 1.5 trillion will come from. But it's also being smart about the cost side.
We're trying to ask everyone, what's an action or position that President Trump has taken that you support or agree with?
I'm thinking. Well, he signed the First Step Act, which was an important first step toward meaningful criminal justice reform. Only a first step. There's a much longer way to go. And as we know, you can only do so much at the federal level, although our Douglas plan contains a number of proposals where we think federal leadership can change what's happening with mass incarceration at the state level, too. But I won't take it away from him that was the right thing to do, to sign that. And I think it reflects an emerging consensus among progressives and a lot of folks I might have thought of as more libertarian or conservative who see the need for us to have a change in the way we handle criminal justice. So I'd point to that. While I do not approve of almost any of the president's decisions with regard to China, I will say that I consider China to be a real challenge, maybe a bigger challenge than a lot of folks in my party think it represents. And so that's an area where my approach would be very different, more regard for human rights, and a more strategic approach on trade versus just poking him in the eye. But I will say that I recognize the China challenge that has been talked about a lot on the other side of the aisle.
A lot of people agree with what you say, and they will say that Trump was on the right track to take on China. But now, if we get these agreements that have been talked about lately, we get back to basically where we started, and I'm not sure we saw any change in policy from China. So, I mean, how would you deal with those challenges that you talk about?
Right. So a lot of what was achieved, if you can call it that, was throwing water on a fire this president created.
Right.
And many of the most significant issues, I'm thinking about intellectual property issues, I'm thinking about state subsidies that make it difficult to ever have an apples to apples comparison or competition, have all been deferred to this mythical phase 2 that something tells me would never happen even in a second term of a Trump administration. What we've got to do is identify the areas where we really do have a security concern, and they're real. I'm thinking about electronics. I'm thinking about the supply chain for our pharmaceuticals. And those are the areas where we got to look at how a responsible decoupling could start to happen. And at the same time, look at areas where we see mutual benefit. Certainly doing what we can to recover export markets for American agriculture. And plenty of other areas where we can have a meaningful partnership. But also make sure that we're doing this in the context of a relationship that's benefiting workers, benefiting farmers, benefiting consumers, and do it in a way that makes clear that we, in fact, care about issues like human rights and democracy. It's not that we're going to march in and change China, but I think it matters when the president signals that his silence can be purchased on something like democracy in Hong Kong or the rounding up of a Muslim minority in Xinjiang. And there needs to be some indication that we will use some of our diplomatic and perhaps economic tools to reinforce our commitment on that side.
Could you tell us about an issue where new information or reflection or talking to the opposition prompted you to change your mind?
Well, lots of parochial fights in South Bend that I won't take you through, but moments where I was certain on day one that I was right, especially early in my first term. and very frustrated and impatient with anybody who got in the way, only to learn through conversation and encounter and listening that actually there was a better way. Sometimes there was a better way than what either I or the opposition were proposing, and part of the beauty of governing, and one of the things I've really valued from being in that executive role in governing is setting a course, encountering all the realities that pressure your original plan, allowing others to shape the outcome, and getting to a place that was better than you would have guessed on the way in. From a national policy perspective, certainly my thinking has developed on China is a good example. Actually, I've become much more attentive over the last 5 or 10 years to the concerns and the challenges there. I think I've developed much more in the direction of criminal justice reform. I would not have said even 5 years ago that what I believe now, which is that incarceration should not even be a response to drug possession. But what I've seen is that while there continue to be all kinds of harms associated with drug possession and use, it's also the case that we have created, in an effort to deal with what amounts to a public health problem, we have created an even bigger problem, a justice problem, and its own form of a health problem. If you think about the adverse impact on a child. We have kids in South Bend who've grown up with the incarceration of a parent as one of their first experiences. That makes them dramatically more likely to wind up themselves having an encounter with the criminal legal system. And so I've always been skeptical of mass incarceration, but now I believe more than ever that we need to take really significant steps, like ending incarceration as a response to simple possession.
And on that, is that across the board? So if it's meth or coke or ecstasy, any drugs, if it's possession, incarceration isn't.
That's right. It doesn't mean legalization of everything. And one issue that gets dramatically less attention than some other forms of addiction is something like synthetic marijuana, for example. In our city, it's mostly affecting African American youth. Personally, wound up on the scene of an overdose where there was a kid, I thought he was having a seizure. This is in a front lawn. I thought he was having a seizure until I saw two other kids who were also passed out, and wound up having this kid propped up against my leg to keep him from rolling over and choking while we waited for the EMTs to come. So I'm very much alive to the harm that drug use can cause. But in a case like that, what we found is it's convenience stores selling this stuff that is basically rat poison sprayed onto grass. You'd be much better off with real marijuana than this stuff, which is very toxic. And we worked with the community to make sure that we were addressing it at the supply end with anybody who was selling it. And that was largely another result of an encounter with a lot of African American leaders in the community who were saying, it's great that you're really concerned about opioids now, but what about this? So this is not to wave away all of the harm created by drugs. I was under a DEA command when I was in Afghanistan, and understand what's at stake in counter-narcotics efforts. But the idea that you can criminalize addiction, or the idea that incarceration is the right way to handle possession, I think has been disproven by American experience over the course of my lifetime.
How would
If
you
not
show-
incarceration, what's the alternative that you would propose?
Well, first of all, we've seen the success of drug courts and diversion courts. Now, this is a good example of how you solve that puzzle of how does federal policy matter when these decisions are made locally, right? The reality is we're seeing more and more counties and states, prosecutors and local criminal legal systems who want to keep people out of incarceration, but don't have the funding, so that there are long backlogs on these alternative to incarceration programs and these diversion courts. That's the example of the sort of thing that federal money ought to go into. It's another example of something that pays for itself. Higher rates of rehabilitation, none of the cost of incarceration, and none of the human cost of people being divided from their family, their community, or whatever support network might be best positioned to help them through an addiction scenario. And again, don't get me wrong, I'm not talking about blanket. I do believe in legalization of marijuana, but I'm not talking about blanket decriminalization of a lot of other harmful substances. I'm saying that our enforcement efforts should be targeted at those who are willfully and sometimes violently profiting off of it, not at those who get caught up at the level of having a substance abuse problem.
How would you approach the job of appointing federal judges, not just to the Supreme Court, but to trial courts across the country?
Well, we, first of all, are seeing the politicization of the courts in a way that really concerns me. Now,
The further politicization.
sure. As you would expect, I'll be appointing judges and justices who share my philosophy, share my understanding about freedom, which includes reproductive freedom, share my understanding about American rights, which includes voting rights. I also think that we need to consider more the range of backgrounds of people who make it to the bench. The fact that someone is dramatically more likely to make it with a background as a prosecutor than with a background as a public defender. Not to take anything away from any schools out east that I might be attached to, but remarkably few schools producing such a vast majority of the people on the bench when we know how much talent others could bring. So I think a lot of it's about the diversity and the range of people that we're looking at for the bench, in addition to their philosophies. And as you know, I've also made the case we should contemplate structural reforms to diminish the political temperature of these appointments in the long run.
Of the U.S. Supreme Court.
That's right.
Right. So what kind of reaction are you getting to that? Like,
Folks
we
are...
talked about the last time you were here.
Yeah.
And it seemed like you were backing away and saying, well, that was just a conversation starter.
Well, what I've said is that it doesn't have to be the only way. And one thing that's happened since I was here is that the legal academic world has moved further in explaining how this could work. There's the article in the Yale Law Journal that came out recently, spelling out some of the different approaches. And the one that I've been happy to popularize is called the balanced bench. Not the only way to do it, but certainly one way to address that problem. The response I'm getting is folks are intrigued, they're puzzled, some are nervous, but everybody seems to recognize that we can't go on like this. And so I think we're achieving the goal, not only of making the case for what may be a good policy. My actual approach would be to set up a commission to evaluate this and competing improvements, all with that same goal of a less political Supreme Court. But also reminding us that these things are options, that we can take real steps to reform a system that is showing its weaknesses right now. That our democracy is really creaking at the seams and joints as it meets 21st century realities. And coming from the state that produced Birch Bayh, who helped lead on constitutional amendments that did everything from moving the voting age to 18 to the 25th, even the Equal Rights Amendment, which didn't make it, but the fact that America had that debate helped produce Title IX. I'm ready to lead an era where we recover our muscle memory as a country for how to talk about big structural questions in our democracy. So I'm glad, and I stand by what I've said on that reform proposal, even acknowledging that it's not something to be taken lightly. It's going to take a long time to arrive at the right answer and unify America around it, and that there may be other competing reform approaches that would have the right effect.
We're at time, so maybe one final question.
Mayor, you're coming back to Iowa this weekend after this debate where some of your competitors raised the points about fundraising and experience. And I didn't really hear a change in your stump speech to Iowans this weekend. And I'm curious why that is in terms of addressing some of these conversations that are maybe happening nationally about your candidacy. Why not have that conversation maybe with Iowans?
Well, as you saw in the debate, I'm certainly prepared to defend from any attack. But my conversation with Iowans is driven by Iowans. And the questions that I get when I'm encountering voters who come up to me to tell me the most important thing going on in their lives is, from people, somebody who's at her wit's end because she's expected to take care of her mother, but even if they can afford it, finds that there's not one long-term care facility that she trusts with somebody that she loves, and is afraid for whether she's doing the right thing as somebody who cares for a loved one, she doesn't have the right number of options. Or a guy who's working 2-3 jobs in the gig economy and doesn't have any meaningful labor protections. Folks coming up to me on rope lines talking about mental health and addiction. They're not coming up to me to debate the finer points of whether, a Washington legislative experience of dealing with legislation is more or less meaningful than the on-the-ground experience of a mayor dealing with these things on the ground. You know what my answer to that question would be. But litigating that is dramatically less important to the folks I'm talking to than the question of what are you going to do to make my life better? Every election, in my opinion, is about one question, and it's the voters' question. How will my life be different if you're president instead of you, or you? And the attacks on and the stuff flying around on social media doesn't change the answer to that question. My job is to make it extremely clear what we're going to do and why and who I'm standing up for. And that's what I think Iowans and voters everywhere are asking of me. How are you going to get me a raise? How are you going to make sure I can get health care, whether I stay in my current job or not? How am I supposed to save for retirement? Is my nephew going to be looked after in the military in an era of endless war? Or is he going to be deployed into a war that began before he was born? These are the questions I'm getting on the campaign trail. And those are the things that motivated me to run for office in the first place. I'm not going to change my focus on those things just because of the day-to-day political cycle.
That sounds like a closing statement, so we'll end it there. Thank you, Mayor.
Thank you.
And look back at DesMoinesRegister.com for all the coverage of the Iowa caucuses.
Thanks very much.